Hi, everyone. Welcome to another workshop hosted by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty here in the Writing Support Center. And today we're going to be presenting a new series called our New and Improved series, where we go back to some of our old presentations that we launched at the beginning of going remote and online, and we update them with some additional information that we have learned. At the Writing Support Center, we believe in growth and improvement, and that applies not only to students, but also to ourselves. So we are going back to some of those earlier presentations and revamping them so that way y'all can have even more additional great information. And today's workshop that we are looking at is responding to online discussion forums. So as a reminder, to get the most out of this workshop, we ask for you to complete the accompanying activity worksheet. If you are completing this workshop for extra credit or as an assignment for class, you do need to fill out the worksheet in order to get credit for watching and reviewing this workshop. And then we also ask that you take your time. One of the beauties of having a video workshop is that you have the opportunity to pause and rewind parts that were confusing or maybe went a little too fast. So feel free to take your time. You can also get up, stretch, take breaks, whatever you need. This is completely on your own time. So just a quick little agenda as to what we will be discussing today. So we're going to be reviewing online etiquette and the purpose of a discussion board. We're also going to be talking about tips for initial posts and then also responding to peers. And throughout this workshop, you'll also have a couple of activities that we will be asking you to do. So to start off, what's a discussion forum or post? Many of you are probably familiar with this now that we have been in online classes for almost a year. But discussion posts and forums are meant to imitate class discussions in a 100% online class. Since the class is completely online, you don't have the opportunity to communicate with your peers the way that you would in a synchronous classroom, either in person or over Zoom. So the discussion posts are really for you to talk to your peers, get to know their thoughts, and have collaboration within the classroom, within the virtual classroom. And it's an opportunity to learn from one another. Because you're communicating purely online, and you might not have the opportunity to get to know your classmates outside of Canvas or whatever chat room that you're using, there are some uh, netiquette or guidelines for how to communicate with people in an online setting, particularly when you don't have the opportunity to talk to someone face to face. So there are a couple of guidelines which we are going to go over. And the first is remember that there's someone behind the screen. So one thing that has come out of social media and online discussion is that sometimes we forget that there's a person on the other side of the screen. And some folks might think that that's an opportunity to be rude or present things in a disrespectful manner. But in the classroom, you have to remember that there is someone on the other side of the screen. So you always want to make sure that you're being respectful, always making sure that you're discussing concepts, not the person, not making assumptions. If something was confusing or if something came off the wrong way, asking it for further clarification to make sure that you are understanding what the person is saying. But again, just making sure that you're responding to everyone with respect. This also means avoiding all caps because when you type in all caps, it tends to come off as if you are yelling on the screen. And again, that could be a little off putting, and it's also not really necessary since the forum is supposed to imitate being in an online setting or talking to someone face to face. You also want to avoid sarcasm because sarcasm or certain types of jokes don't always translate well in in an online discussion forum. So just avoiding it to play it safe. Um, And then lastly, you always want to make sure that you're reviewing your posts before you're submitting them. So not just to double check for grammar and understanding, but also just making sure that what you are writing is respectful and contributing to the class and not going off on a tangent or unintentionally attacking someone when you're responding. So typically, these online discussion posts will consist of two parts. Not always. I always recommend that you read the directions carefully, but it'll usually consist of an initial post where the professor is asking you to answer a question or provide a paragraph or provide a reflection. Um, and this is what the professor is asking you to do as your first post. So this is the part where where you're answering the prompt the professor put forth. And then the second part usually consists of responding to your peers. So again, these online discussion posts are meant to imitate class discussion. So sometimes that'll include responding to peers because that's what you would do in a face-to-face classroom. So when you're getting ready to post your initial response, one, you want to make sure that you read the directions carefully, you have an understanding of what the professor is asking you to do. Um, and if whether or not they want you to reference the reading, whether or not they want you to pull from specific parts of the reading, do they want you to focus on one thing? Do they want you to focus on multiple things? Etc. So making sure that you're reading the directions carefully and have that understanding before you're responding. So that way, when you post your response, you're answering the prompt directly. Second, don't be afraid to ask questions. So this could be both in your post and outside of your post. So if you're unsure about what the prompt is asking, feel free to send an email to your instructor to ask for clarification. But also, you can ask questions. If you had questions about the reading, you can ask those questions in your initial post. Chances are it'll provide an opportunity for your classmates to respond to you, and you can potentially gain clarity from your classmates, and it'll just be a really great conversation starter. And also, questions are a valid form of engaging with texts and readings, because it shows that you had an understanding and now you want to know more. Third, always make sure that you add the why or the how and reference your reading. So whenever you're making a statement, whether you're saying like, I agree with the author, you always want to make sure you add that why and the how, because that provides practice for analysis, which you will be using when you're writing your essay. And of course, referencing your readings because you want to show your professor that you did the reading and you have an understanding of it, and now you're practicing how to integrate quotes. One thing to remember about discussion forums is that they're also a really great opportunity to practice writing for your essays. So this is the opportunity for you to practice integrating quotes and adding analysis. Uh, I also recommend posting early and on time. So keep track of when your discussion posts are due. If your professor has certain discussion posts due on a certain day of every week, making sure you have that on your calendar just to make sure that you are one, making sure that you're meeting the deadline, but two, when you're posting early, you have the opportunity to present your ideas first. You're less likely to be repetitive, and you're able to bring in your ideas. If you end up having to post a little later, that's totally fine. Just make sure that you read some of the earlier posts that have been presented so that way you can see what others have already talked about and how you can add into the conversation. Make sure you review and proofread your responses. You want to make sure that it's coming off clearly. Again, you want to make sure that you are presenting ideas that are brought forth by the reading and answering the prompt. So just making sure that you review and proofread everything to make sure that it makes sense. Um, a way that you can construct your initial responses is by using the acronym IDEA. So the I stands for identify, interpret, or infer. You want to make sure you identify the concept that you were talking about, you interpret it a little bit, and you make any additional um, analysis about it. And that goes into the define and the dissect. You want to make sure you're defining these concepts and providing a little bit more of analysis on them. Explore and explain, again, just going more into detail about the concept that you're discussing that your professor has presented through the prompt and the readings. And then lastly, analyze, apply, and advocate. So if you're making an argument, making sure that you're supporting that argument and using your readings to support it. All right. So now we're gonna go into our first activity. So on the accompanying worksheet that is found in the module, review the prompts that are presented on the worksheet. Using IDEA and the additional tips provided on the previous slide, draft potential responses to these prompts. So this doesn't have to be perfect. This is just a draft. This is an opportunity for you um, to practice posting an initial response. Or if you want to work off of a discussion post that you're preparing for class, this is your opportunity to do so as well. All right. So now we have the second part. Again, make sure to read the instructions. Not all professors will require the second part, but if you're in a class that's 100% online, you might need to do this part of responding to peers. And this part, the reason professors will often assign the second part to discussion posts is because it's meant to work as a conversation. They want you to engage with your classmates. They want you to collaborate with them and learn from them. Making sure that you are responding to others can be a critical part of that learning process. And we do have a couple guidelines and tips on how to respond to your peers. And the first is by validating the post by sharing your experience and its relation to the course. So, acknowledging whom you're talking to and whom you're responding to, and either agreeing or disagreeing, or adding on to their experiences. So it's really helpful if you point out one or two key things that you took from that initial post from your peer, and then addressing those in your response, but also explaining why and how you think it's important, or why you're agreeing or disagreeing, how your experiences either support or contradict what they are discussing about. Again, you want to keep it respectful. You're not going to agree with everything that your classmates are saying, but you do want to make sure that you maintain civility and respectfulness within the classroom. So making sure that you're addressing the ideas and not the person. If you're if the and if your peer posed a question, reply to the question that they have responded. So that's why I always say that if you have an initial, um, if in if you have a question and you want to put that in your initial response, that's great because you're more likely to get engagement and responses from your peers because your peers will respond to that question. Um, Another thing that you can do is you can ask another probing question. So if you want to engage a little more, continuing that cycle of questions so that you can have that back and forth. Um, you can also share insight or something you learned from reading your peers' posts. So again, you're interpreting someone else's understanding. So you can say like, "Thank you from your post. I see XYZ," and you can share what you learned from them. And you can also talk about how they helped you understand the material. So if you had any questions that you hadn't presented, but your peer addressed those questions in their response, you can let them know, "Oh, thank you so much. Like I actually had questions regarding this topic, but thanks to your response, I now have an understanding of it a little more." You can offer opinion and support it. So again, using your readings to support what you are discussing, and again, creating conversation through your discussion forum. Uh, Relating the information to the course. So if your peer post it about an experience. You can say how you completely understand and see how that relates to the reading or how it relates to the overall theme of the course. Another really great thing is to tie all of the ideas together. So if you're seeing a common theme um, that is being brought up by multiple classmates, bring all of those ideas together and say like, oh, I've noticed this theme, and tell us why you think that theme is important. And of course, as always, just making sure that you are citing sources for all your references. So if you're ever referencing the book, or if you ever want to tie it into the concept of the class, making sure that you're pulling from your readings to demonstrate that understanding. So now we're going to go into our second activity. So going back to the worksheet that is found in the module, go to one of your classes and select a peer discussion post to respond to. In the space provided, draft a potential peer response using the tips provided in the previous slide. And some additional tips that are a little more logistical to help you stay on top of your work include making sure that you adhere to word limits. So sometimes your professor will say in a post of 500 to 700 words, or 2 to 300, whatever it is, just making sure that you're adhering to those word limits. Your professor is asking for them just so that way because they're expecting a certain length of response. So making sure that you include that. Once again, if you have a question about the assignment, send an email to your instructor. They're more than happy to provide clarification because they want to see you succeed. So making sure that you're providing that clarification, making sure that you email them so you get that clarification will help you succeed on that assignment. Use campus resources to help you put together a response. So if you're having some questions, you're having questions on how to put together your response, feel free to come into the Writing Support Center. We're more than happy to help you brainstorm your ideas and get ready to post your response. I always recommend beginning your response on a word processor to avoid losing your work. Sometimes when you try writing directly into Canvas, there's a chance that Canvas might either crash, it'll unintentionally log you out, maybe you had to step away from it and it times you out, and so you lose all of that work. So I always recommend copy and paste the question into a Word document, a Google Doc, whatever it is that you use, and draft your response there. That way, if for some reason Canvas does stop working or it logs you out, you still have access to what you were drafting. And then once again, set reminders for when your responses are due. So that way you're staying on top of your work and avoiding falling behind and trying to play catch up later on. All right. So some final reminders. One, there is someone behind the screen, so always make sure that you're responding to your classmates with respect and understanding. Making sure that you are just being polite, and being online does not erase being respectful to one another. Second, make sure that you read the directions carefully and respond on time. So make note of those due dates and making sure that you have an understanding of what the professor is asking you to respond to. Be sure to elaborate and use class sources. So making sure that you're always answering that why and the how, and using quotes from the text to support what you're saying. When you're responding to your peers, be sure to tie ideas together to help create collaboration and conversation. Feel free to ask questions in your post. So this could be either in a response to a peer, this could be in your initial post, this could be asking for clarification from your instructor, but just making sure that you're asking those questions because questions are a great starting off point. And just a reminder that discussion posts are an opportunity to communicate with your peers, especially if you are in a class that is 100% online, no Zoom meetings whatsoever. This is your opportunity to get to know your classmates. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope that this will help you be successful in your online courses. As always, if you ever need writing support, feel free to come into the Writing Support Center. We are open Monday through Thursday from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and on Fridays from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. You can find our link. Just click on the button that says Meet with a Tutor that is on our webpage. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. Bye.